modern sociologists have made some analysis of the function of secret societies in the development of man's modern culture. And while these findings are for the most part based entirely upon cultural factors, they give us some rather interesting information which we can enrich and enlarge through reference to a larger frame of research. First of all, a secret society is usually a group of persons divided from their contemporaries by certain obligations, private assembly, and addiction to a particular or special code of conduct. Such societies began, of course, in the primitive world. Early in the history of man's social experience, tribes, barbaric, primitive, savage, developed secret societies. These were particularly concerned with the over-concept of that time, namely the importance of certain rituals and ceremonies in connection with the building of the individual into his tribal life. All of the important periods of life were marked with ritual, ceremony, and symbol. And the most important of ancient ceremonies of this nature had to do with the concept of citizenship as it was then understood. By certain trials, obligations, and revelations, the person was prepared to become part of his social order. In tribal times, he received the wisdom of his tribe, and he proved that he was worthy of that wisdom by undergoing certain trials, real or psychological dangers, indicating his heroism, his patience, his willingness to self-sacrifice, his dedication to the same principles which governed his tribal life. After his initiation into the secret societies, he became a full-fledged member of his community. We may therefore say that in this respect, the secret society was also the school, the university, if we may say such, of primitive society. Here the accumulated wisdom of the people was made available to each new generation through ritual and ceremony. At the same time, the secret society bound the person to his spiritual conviction. Through this association, he came to know the deities believed to govern his tribe. He was religiously obligated to the ideals and principles of the tribal faith. All of his political and social instruction suspended from his religious conviction. It was therefore incredible that anyone could pass through these tribal mysteries without becoming strongly convinced of the importance of the religion of his people. In addition to these important factors, the tribe and the tribal mysteries had to do with the genetic problems recognized at that time. Among our southwestern Indians, for example, each Pueblo has two sides, and the members of these sides have certain religious obligations and certain tribal rites and ceremonies. Marriage must always be across the pueblo. In other words, marriage must always be into the opposite social group. This was important, as experience had taught that too close intermarriage might prove detrimental to the tribal life. Laws governing conduct were also measured across the pueblo. But in all important matters, the two sides met for conference, consultation, and contemplation of the vital needs of the whole people. Gradually, the secret societies became the virtual custodians of authority, causing the modern sociologists to advance the concept that they were highly autocratic groups. If this may be considered legitimate, it may be pointed out that all life at all times has been a curious blending of autocratic leadership and a democratic state. Any individual who assumes leadership, even with the consent of the governed, gains certain autocratic powers and prerogatives. It was the work of the old secret societies to so enrich the cultural, moral, and spiritual life of the leader that he might not be inclined to pervert his authority or to use his powers to exploit or enslave his peoples. Thus the secret society educated the leader not merely in the arts and sciences, as we generally consider them, but in the moral values and in the ethical overtones essential to proper government or any executive or responsible position. In the classical world, the secret society took a new form. It became more exclusively the custodian of learning. And we may say that through the classical world, particularly Greece, Egypt, and the Roman Empire, most secret societies were not basically political in their implications. It is true that no individual can refrain from some involvement in politics, especially if he is an informed and conscientious person. It cannot be said that Plato was a politician, nor can it be said that the Platonic dialogues are completely non-political. To the philosopher, politics represents enlightened leadership, and he contributes in every way that he can toward this end. And in periods of despotism or tyranny, his weight is naturally against vested authority which has perverted its privileges. For this reason, many prominent leaders in the religious, philosophical, and cultural life of mankind have been persecuted and even martyred because they have interfered with entrenched political beliefs. During the classical period also, we see the secret society moving behind nearly all forms of generalized education. In Rome, Greece, and Egypt, young people were tutored by professional teachers. After they had received what we might term a broad education, considering the opportunities and knowledge of their day, they were then, for the most part, presented for initiation into one of the secret societies, it being understood that it was the duty of such societies to integrate the person, to give him the associations, the dedications, the consecrations, by means of which his knowledge in any field might be clarified, deepened, and the danger of selfishness or perversion mitigated so far as was possible. This is the general story. And of course, even in the classical period, the overtones remained essentially religious. The secret societies were sanctuaries. Those who entered them were instructed in the true meaning of their faith, were given certain keys or interior knowledge, and as in Oriental religious societies, they were given certain scientific methods for the advancement of their personal lives, particularly their internal development of resources. The secret society was psychologically symbolic of the internal life of every person. While we live in this world, and to a measure of this world, nearly every person has a more or less secret world of his own. This secret world may be no more than a series of convictions differing from or in advance of popular convictions. The individual who is thoughtful envisions a better world than the one in which he lives. He sees the possibility of man gaining a richer life, developing greater internal securities, and looking around him, he discovers that it is difficult for him to impress these broad convictions upon society. Society is highly dominated by conditioned reflexes, and is the individual attempting to live above or beyond his clan or class tries to spread his convictions, he meets mostly with opposition. He finds, therefore, that it is inconvenient and injudicious merely to approach strangers with his thoughts. His natural instinct is to seek out others of his own kind, binding himself with them, and finding in their association the opportunity for greater self-expression. Thus clubs, groups arise today around certain principles which they feel need or require organized minorities to advance these principles through common effort. If these principles were identical with the common practices, there would be no need for secret assembly. But if these principles are not identical, even though they may be entirely friendly, kindly, non-political, if they are not totally identical with the public mind, then those so interested and so dedicated inevitably form private groups. These private groups advance charities, practice various benevolences, do all that they can to increase the cultural advantage of their members and often of non-members. These kinds of assemblies also were known in antiquity. But in those times, men seldom gathered for trivial purposes. They seldom gathered to meet the simple requirements of the day, inasmuch as society itself, being essentially more simple and having certain natural attitudes, it was not necessary to form special societies to advance the commonplace needs of the people. These societies then went after objectives that were not commonplace. We have another group important to consider in the light of the prevailing way of life of ancient man. During the so-called Golden Age of